Well, what about the fame of some European things? And there's stuff that they should be teaching these kids at school. Nobody's teaching them anything. Some of these interesting, well, here's an example. The other day, I have a 10-year-old son, and I asked him if he'd ever heard of the pyramids, and he said, yeah. And I said, where are they? And he says, Egypt. Now, this is a guy who doesn't know anything about geography, countries. I'm surprised he knows the word Egypt at all, really. It's not like he knows anything about the Mideast or any of these countries. I said, how many is there? He said, 3. They've never taken it at school. No, it's the knowledge. It's just out there, right? That's a great example. I said, well, you know of any other pyramids? Well, of course. I mean, it's ridiculous. Nobody does. But in the Western Hemisphere, the American Indian, they had hundreds and hundreds of pyramids. And had some of them larger in square footage than the pyramids in Egypt. That's the way it goes. About the Appian Way. You hear a lot about the Appian Way that the Romans had. And now that was 300 BC. You know, it was a little bit earlier, and that's great. But that's something that people are always aware of, that this technology. They had this highway, you know, went from Rome. So the Appian Way was basically one lane wide. It was 300 miles long, which is 500 kilometers. It was 300 BC. It was nice. It was basically a leveled road with some gravel, and then over top of that it had some stones, some with mortar, some with not. It was leveled so that in the middle the water ran off from the middle, had ditches on either side, so pretty good. Now what about the highway in the Americas, in the Andean Mountains? Now that was the originally the civilization that went from around 500 AD up to 800 to 1000 AD originally started a highway, and they worked on it, and then it was built on from there. So by the time the 13, 14, 1500s came, this highway was done. So the Appian Way is 300 miles long. This is 3,200 miles long. 5,200 kilometers. And if you stretched out all the tributaries from the road, it was actually 25,000 miles. 40,000 kilometers of highway. One lane, sometimes 2 lanes wide. Or 25,000 miles, what does that sound like? You recognize that figure? That's the size of the whole Earth. So all the tributaries from this highway were long enough to go all the way around the whole world. Never taught in schools. Nobody knows about it. Hidden information. Now these stones were fitted together. Engineers are studying them now. In the last 5-10 years, engineers have gone there trying to figure out what they did. These stone roads, at some point in one of the provinces, it was as small as 1 to 4 meters. So typically 13 feet would be the size of it. They had sections, most of it was about 2 lanes wide, so 15 to 20 feet. Sections of it were 150 feet across. So this went, and this is the mountains. Now a lot of this road was up 5,000 feet above sea level. Suspension bridges they had. That's a great accomplishment. Suspension bridges, cutting through mountains, going over ravines. They had a lot of suspension bridges. They were made out of reed material, vegetation material. They had gondolas for some of them where it was just too wide for suspension bridges. They had gondolas that they could ride across. And it figures if you're going to have a road that's 5,200 kilometers, that's longer than from New York to LA, or around the same distance. That's what we're talking about. The Appian Way, everybody knows about that. 300 miles. Pretty small compared to this. And sections of it that were 100 to 150 feet across. Now, each locale, as many of the things that the indigenous people did, they tended to have things done locally. And that is why this highway is confounding the engineers, because they can't get a road to last for 50, 60 years. And this is getting on to 600, 700, 800 years old. Many of the American Indian ways of doing things were done within the local landscape, with local knowledge, local tools, using local topography, the information that they had locally. Every area is a little bit different. You can't just always come and implant something from somewhere else in the world and do a cookie cutter approach and put it everywhere and make it work. It was tried over and over and over and over again, and this is a good example of that. The technology in each province might be different because the local people were left to handle that particular part of the highway and to maintain that particular part of the highway. If you have suspension bridges made out of hemp and material and rope, of course it has to be maintained. Now many the suspension bridges, they would normally have two of them. Now partly for the ruling people to cross and the common people to cross, but also they would always have their highway intact 100% of the time if you had two of them. If they were working on one, then you would have the other one. But digging through mountains, it was all done with hand tools, and bronze was the hardest metal that they had. It's without iron. There was no beasts of burdens available to them. The llama was the biggest animal, which couldn't carry a person and couldn't pull a lot of heavy items, so they was basically built the entire thing by hand, which makes it even more amazing. Now they had a way of dealing with water, and that's when I say it confounds the engineers, of exactly what they did. So you may go there and look at this highway, sections of it, it's still in use today. A good part of it is still in use today, and there's a strong spiritual element to this highway for the people who still use it today, and at that time as well too. Underneath the highway, especially as you get well up into the mountains, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet, a lot of what they did you don't even see, because they had a way of dealing with the water through causeways and cisterns and runoff methodologies and holding bins for the water. And it wasn't just that, but you've also got a lot of natural catastrophes that can happen, and they can differ by area, and this road has managed to withstand a lot of that. Now, how do you handle a project that's so huge as this? You need a strong political foundation to do any large project involving hundreds of thousands of people. You need a lot of strong political, some type of government that's strong enough to hold that together. And the road was partly what was helping them hold things together. Now they had a system whereby they could get information along this road, and not only that, but goods as well too. We wonder how the trade happened up and down the Americas from the North Pole to Tierra del Fuego, how some of this information traveled and the food that was shared. And in that particular area, we get a little bit of a hint of it, is that trade was a big thing. Travel and trade was a very big deal. They had little houses posted every so often along this entire road. Keep in mind now, we're talking about 5,200 kilometers of road. They had little overnight houses stationed at certain positions along this road for people that were traveling on the road. They also had runners stationed. About every 6, 7, 8, 9 kilometers, they had a runner stationed on the road. And so this runner could take information, they had an information system, they had a news type of system, and that's how it was handled. So these runners could travel 250 kilometers in a day between them, because they would run from one outpost to the next, and they always had fresh runners waiting at each outpost. So 250 kilometers a day. So in 8 days, they could travel, information could travel 2,000 kilometers. information, or some goods that weren't heavy enough that they were needing to be traveling carried by llama or something like that. Which, by the way, they used only baskets. That's all a llama could carry. They couldn't carry a person or any type of heavy burdens, and they couldn't pull anything of note at all either. So they usually use baskets. But information traveled. Now, how did the information travel? If you've got so many people running, the news, of course, would get lost over time, would start to distort and change. But, well, the Indians didn't have writing, right? Oh, well, what are you going to do? Well, just the same as in North America, they had beaded Indian belts. They had wampum. They had beaver information. They had things that could be read, not just oral histories. They didn't have an alphabet. That very, very important thing, though, that also did not come from the white man in Europe, as most people would tend to think. Just like arithmetic wasn't invented in Europe. And reading and writing were not invented in Europe. They came from a very dark-skinned race thousands of miles to the south. They were introduced up into Europe, in Greece and some of those areas in the Aegean. So how did they travel? Well, they are certain that they used these little beaded knot systems so that the news wouldn't get distorted as these runners carried the news from one end of the highway or through these provinces into the next provinces or wherever the information happened to be going. Now, these little ropes with knots in them, it's only very recently that people have come to realize that that's some sort of a language, which is it's pretty funny because some of these they're known to be from that era, and some of them, I guess, are very beautiful, but they're just considered something along the lines of artwork. There's been suspicions over time that maybe they had something to do with arithmetic or with math. And these are scattered in museums all over the world. Now suddenly they have to start looking at them. They realize there's a language there involved. This is communication. All the little knots meant something. And these runners traveling on these roads, that's what they were using. When there's a message they had to carry, they would give them one of these little ropes. And they were, of course, all different across the areas. But that's how they carried these messages. So you've got the irrigation, the amazing job they were able to do with their irrigation. You got the fact that these highways are still in existence a long time later. Just the actual mass and breadth of these roads, and the fact that they were able to do this type of a project and have it in place in the 14 and 1500s. Nobody knows anything about it. There's a bunch of savages running around in the woods in diapers. How could they put something like that together? That's what everybody thinks of it, right? So anyway, that's the Camino Real is the name of that highway. The Appian Way, I don't want to knock anything about the Appian Way. I'm sure it's very nice, but come on, everybody knows about the Appian Way. How come? What's wrong? I'll tell you what's wrong. You know what's wrong.